And there we are, making of a field guide. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, when I agreed to give this talk, it was at a time of optimism that it would indeed have been published by now. And it was been in the catalogues, and it would have been winging its way to those with pre-orders. But as always, life got in the way. This is therefore the story of the making of a book, the delights and the pitfalls, painting a picture of projects past, unforeseen circumstances, and hopefully what is to come. Together with a little bit about what we're attempting to achieve to make this uniquely different from other guides on the market. That's the front cover of the book. As you see there, British and Irish Wildflowers and Plants, a pocket guide from the Wild Guide series of Princeton University Press. So given that I can't show you the book as such, just little bits of it, and what I'm going to start off with is actually talking a little bit more widely about books and my life in books, and indeed probably many of your lives in books. As naturalists, we all love books. We all use books. We all probably have too many books. That's just a small proportion of the books that I have. And bear in mind that our flat has a floor space of something like 8 by 7 meters. It's too many books is always a problem. We do try and have a policy of one in, one out, but we don't really manage to stick with that. But my passion for books goes back a long, long time. Probably the same for everybody here. Goes back to our youth, to a time of the I Spy books, the Ladybird books, the Observer books. These were the formative books of their time. So for those like me, I was born right at the start of the 1960s. These were the books that shaped me as a naturalist. And that love of books continues right on to the current day with most recent purchases of all the most recent magnificent tome from the BSBI, the Plant Atlas 2020, 2 volumes. The older books, like those Observer books, well, they weighed in at a grand total of something like 200 grams. The Plant Atlas, with its 2 volumes, is more like 8.5 kilograms. The books have got bigger and heavier and do require reinforcement of the bookshelves. But it's a magnificent book, and I will be talking more about that one later in the talk. But from a very early age, I longed to see my name on a book or inside a book. And the first chance for that was actually in 1990, when I was approached to write a chapter for this modest paperback, The Rough Guide to the Wildlife of the Mediterranean Wildlife, based upon my early explorations of the Algarve. I was asked to write the chapter on the Algarve, and yep, I wrote it, and yes, I got paid for it. I was hooked. By then, I was working for Nature Conservancy Council, then English Nature and Natural England, as indeed I spent my entire career doing until early retirement. And by a circuitous route of providing images for our corporate publications, I got introduced to Dorling Kindersley, first providing images and then authenticating and copy editing Pocket Nature series of lightweight, small, pocket-sized guides. So many of those I actually had something of a hand in one capacity or another. That led on to other contributions for DK, working on larger books, much more coffee table books, contributing directly, but also ghostwriting for Chris in the case of Nature Handbook. That culminated just after the year 2000 with their magnum opus, which was the Natural History book. You can't quite see that with the white writing there. There's a bit of a design fault, I think, but the Natural History book, the ultimate visual guide to everything on Earth. Well, as always with DK, slightly overblown rhetoric, but it was a very interesting book to work on. I was given half of the mammals of the world to contribute. I had the photos in front of me. I had a space of 22 words for each species in which to capture something about its appearance, something about its distribution, and something special about it. Quite a hard task, writing a haiku about all of these species, most of which I'd never even heard of previously. But that's DK for you. And I enjoyed doing that sort of thing. Of course, this also led on directly to being commissioned to write 2 guides for the Pocket Nature series. First of all, Pocket Nature Wild Animals, which is a guide to all of the mammals, reptiles and amphibians of Europe, and then Seashores of Europe, which covered everything from the Baltic down to the Mediterranean, obviously in less comprehensive scope. The ones on the left are as they first appeared. The ones on the right are how they appeared when the RSPB took over the imprint. What's disappeared? My name. I'm not bitter, but anyway, it still appears on the inside cover, but it's not on the front cover. Great fun with those publications, well, particularly the Seashores book, because it allowed me to do 2 things which have had a lasting effect on me. First of all, the lichen down there, Xanthoria periotina. That's how we know it, that's how everyone knows it, and that's how it was only known when I wrote the book. I wanted to include it in the book. DK said to me, you can't call it that. It's got to have an English name. So I thought long and hard, and I looked left, right and centre on the internet, tried to find an English name. There wasn't one till I came across one in some obscure Eastern European language, which translated as the sunburst lichen. Aha, I thought. Sunburst lichen, that captures it perfectly. Got it in there, and it now actually comes up as the in the English lexicon as far as the names of lichens are concerned. It is the sunburst lichen. So very happy about that. Even more happy though about those things bottom left. When I was dealing with the flotsam and jetsam and strandline elements of the Seashore book in the Mediterranean, I wanted to introduce the sea balls from the fibres of the roots of Posidonia, the seagrass, that wash up in balls on Mediterranean coastlines. It's really they're produced simply by the wave and tide actions, jumbling everything up. It's like the fluff balls that gather in the bottom of your washing machine, or indeed your belly button. And when I was just prior to writing the book, I was in Minorca. I was told that they have a very interesting name in the local vernacular there. So bearing in mind that these guides were sub-edited in Delhi, I thought I'd push out the boat a little bit and see whether I could get this in, the name of them being Nun's Farts. And it got through. So there I am in press, having got Nun's Farts through the editors, and that's now there in the back of that book for anyone who wants to read it. So that then brings us on to wild guides. I'd been aware of wild guides since its very inception. Indeed, I went to university with one of the directors of wild guides, and I subsequently worked with the other one of the directors when he still had a job working for the Ministry of Agriculture. So as the DK works dried up, So my work with wild guides came to the fore. And especially over the last 8 years or so, and in fact we, myself and Jude, have been increasingly closely involved with wild guides, proofreading, copy editing, rewriting whole books or whole sections of books. We do it together. I provide the technical input, Jude provides the English. And we really feel invested in the wild guides approach, at least in recent volumes, things like Britain's Spiders, for example, and Britain's Orchids and Britain's Ferns. They always aim to provide a structured approach to identification, allowing and developing understanding of the process of identification, rather than just flick and pick. So it was very pleasing for me that just before I retired from Natural England, Wild Guides came to me and said, would I be responsible for delivering a comprehensive British flora into the Wild Guides stable? Well, I thought long and hard, actually, realizing it was quite a big job. Yes, I thought for quite a while, but eventually said yes, provided I can do what's necessary as part of a team. I realized straight away this needed to be a team effort. So I was thrilled, but not so thrilled that I said yes straight away. I had to think about it and started to assemble the team. Obviously myself, as an all-round naturalist, very comfortable with using keys, plus a photographer of plant portraits and landscapes to contribute into the what were intended as being 3 volumes of a comprehensive British plant flora. The second person in the team was Rob from Wild Guides, the graphic designer extraordinaire. He is the person who was responsible, for example, in the early Wild Guides, of producing those remarkable hybrid photos of in this case, large skipper butterflies in different poses, we're in different stages of their life cycle, in concentrations that you would never see in nature, all making them look at least relatively natural against a naturalized background. So he was the second very important contribution to the team to produce these books. Fortunately, also, he was a developing, although initially rudimentary, botanist. Now he's an expert and a fantastic set piece photographer, as you'll see later on. The third person to join the team was Rachel, a good friend of mine and the wife of my former boss, a professional botany teacher for many years at degree level. Not only a user of keys, but a designer of them. I knew she'd always harbored the desire to write the book she'd always wanted to teach from, but never before had the opportunity. That's the upside. The downside, of course, well into her 70s, she has the tendency to be a little over scientific in language and jargon, and therefore perhaps not an ideal match with the Wild Guides ethos. However, she agreed, we talked together, and we now have a very good working team of 3. Subsequently, we added a 4th member to the team, another photographer, to boost up the close-up photo capacity, although that was all too brief. And then the final 5th member of the team is the crucial member of the team, our senior editor from Princeton University Press, Robert, in charge of financing, publicity, and protecting us, the authors, from the whims of the bean counters, shall we say, back over there in Princeton. So we started the initial plan of writing a 3-volume full flora of Britain, albeit not a critical flora, dealing with just 4 dandelions rather than all 360 of them. Likewise, the microspecies of rubus are not covered in our guide. To be honest, that suits me as a botanist, really. But I've never got into these critical microspecies. I don't really believe in those microspecies. A lot of them are just single gene variants, and the only reason that they're treated as separate species is because they don't breed, because they can't breed. They're not sexual. So yes, there are some botanists who are specialists in these particular groups, but they've already got their specialist guides anyway. We wouldn't contribute anything to the wider canon of work if we padded out our guide or guides with 300 of them and 400 of them. You know, it just wouldn't work in that sense. We have quite enough to do dealing with the plants we can recognise without a lifetime's study. British flora may be relatively depauperate in European terms, but of course the wild flora now is also substantially supplemented by non-natives. And indeed that is our plan, not only to cover all native species, but all those non-natives that one can reasonably expect to find in the wild. The latest estimates are something like 40% of all our wild flora, maybe even higher than that now, constitute non-native species. As far as reasonably expect to find in the wild is concerned, well, we've taken an arbitrary cutoff there of anything that's found in 200 or more of the 3,500 10-kilometre squares. Any non-native species that's found in 200 or more squares, we are including in the book. So once again, we are being selective. We are not showing everything in the book simply because we can't. Our non-native flora is changing all the time, so we cannot hope to be ever comprehensive in that score. So what is the USP of the book? First of all, it will be largely photographic. There may be the odd line drawings and illustrations, but by and large, it will be photographic only, as is the normal case with Wild Guides books, with the single exception of the Britain's Orchids book, which has, as well as photos, some beautiful paintings inside it. We are certainly going to keep jargon to a minimum. Wild Guides do not want to alienate the beginners. We do not want to be elitist, which is what jargon tends to do to keep a subject elite. It will be a key-based flora. We want to aid understanding of identification. It's not, desperately not, a flick and pick guide. We want to provide people with the opportunity. They can flick and pick, yes, but we want to provide them with a way of working through the guide in order to aid understanding. The keys, though, will not be of a rigid format. Hitherto, virtually all of the full floras of Britain have had one rigid format or another to their keys, mostly dichotomous and mostly without visual threading. We are having visual threading, flowcharts, and leading you through the pages from place to place. And at many of the decision points, we've got non-dichotomous choices. Well, the old god of botanists might tut at that, but we believe that modern folks can actually cope with multiplicities of inputs. They watch the television nowadays, and you're watching the person who's speaking, you're reading the ticker tape across the bottom, you're reading the headlines along the top, and there's also extra little bits. People can cope with that nowadays. We're not sticking just to the dichotomous approach to creating keys. And where valuable and appropriate, we're putting in additional means of reaching identification. This is the sort of thing that was first brought forward in botanical terms in the BSBI's plant crib, where not only keys were used, but also comparison tables and such like. We're providing the way of identification which works for a particular group, whether that be a family, a genus, or within a genus. Horses for courses is what's going to define the approach we're taking in this guide. And this is what it's starting, or was starting, to look like. This is just the front page of the Ranunculaceae, the buttercup family, with the various genera within that family laid out graphically with a few words, nice pictures, instructive pictures, and lots of signposting within the pages, how to get to the next step. And in the case of the yellow ranunculus species down here in the bottom right, well, that moves on then to several pages like this, with the yellow flowered buttercups laid out, similar ones nearby each other, lots of use of icons and images. Forget the in here we've got the wheels are all standard here, as are many of the images. This was before we managed to populate all this, and of course also the maps at this stage were just put in as placeholders. But that's the basic way that it was envisaged it would start to look. I say start to look, it was envisaged that, because what then happened was COVID. We ran into the unknown and the unforeseen, the brick wall of COVID. One of the first victims of COVID, she contracted it right at the first week of the first lockdown, was one of the linchpins of the team, the writer of our new reliable keys. And still, 2 years on, 3 years on, she is suffering from long COVID. The second victim was one of our photographic team. The mental stresses of COVID isolation led him to, as it did for all of us, rethink our life's priorities, and he pulled back from contributing. It also impacted upon myself and Rob, who had been planning, going around the country, taking photos left, right and centre, all the necessary photos to fill the book up with. Whilst we'd had a budget for the book, we hadn't a photographic budget, so we were expected to be taking them all ourselves. And also, if the truth be known, during COVID, all of our hearts went out of the project. Despite all the work we put in, things barely ticked over for a moment. It was an odd time for everybody, and we simply lost momentum. While we're losing momentum, of course, writing for me didn't stop. The life on hold pause gave much time for reflection. And Jude helped me realise there was something I could also be doing usefully to write down my experiences of living and working by the Essex coast. The first lockdown, spring and early summer, the weather was so good, I didn't want to be sitting in front of a computer. So yes, all we did was think, yeah, a book would be a good idea. The second short lockdown, saw some action creating this, a facsimile version of a booklet I'd previously written for work for the Nature Conservancy Council, well, for English Nature, I think that particular one, and a 32-page booklet, which I laid out, took the photos for, and made available as a free PDF. It is indeed still available as a free PDF. Jude, ever the person to keep me grounded, also pointed out this was perhaps more than many folk would actually want to read. So she led on producing a slimmed down, visually celebratory version, much shorter, much more focused on the photos with fewer and fewer words. And both of those were available by the end of that second month-long lockdown. The next lockdown loomed, and so we took the opportunity to think more expansively, indulgently even, and start working on much bigger work. We started writing on the Boxing Day of that particular Christmas. We started our writing up on the Stour, the northern part of Essex. And after a mental walk right round the Essex coast, something like 400 kilometres, and 85,000 words later, and 3 months later, we finished at the Olympic Park just as the lockdown ended. This guide we've been writing we've termed not just a field guide to the Essex coast. It's much about the places, plants and animals of the Essex coast, but it's rather more than that. It covers a range of other disciplines of interest, again, reflecting particularly Jude's interests, with essays of diverse topics such as history, architecture, literature, etc., which we hope and trust that actually anyone who has a soul and loves wildlife and the countryside will actually be interested in. So it is a travelogue, though not necessarily a step-by-step guide. It relies on people being able to get about independently. The sort of guides, turn left at the dead cow, are so easily and quickly outdated that we thought that wasn't really necessary. It's also a call to arms to help protect the place we know and love, and to some extent also a professional autobiography for me. We soon realised that no one would ever want to carry around with them a brick of 500 pages walking around the Essex coastline, though. So we planned it in the form of 6 volumes, which would be relatively slim 100-page volumes for to anyone to carry around with them on one particular stretch of the coastline. And indeed, we have laid out one of those volumes, volume 3, the bit in which we live, in the following format. We like it, but will it ever be published? Well, there's a different matter. Few approaches that we've made so far to publishers have been, shall we say, politely rebuffed. But does it matter? Well, perhaps not. If nothing else, we could see it as a series of digital giveaways. And what it most certainly did do for us is to give us a focus, to give us a sense of purpose during that soul-sapping 3-month winter lockdown. And that sense of purpose continues, because whilst it was easy enough to fill the Cone volume up with our own recent images, not so the others, where sometimes I hadn't even been for decades, if at all. So since that summer, I've been out and about visiting the more or less familiar areas with a renewed focus, and indeed many of the blogs on my website feature the photographs and words from those particular expeditions. Seeing the world through the prism of the pandemic, though, reintroduced all these aspects of the natural and unnatural history of the Essex coastline into our lives. We learned to look anew, and, well, here's one of those ways in which we looked anew. One of the discoveries of the first week of the first lockdown, just 100 metres from our flat on the waterfront in Wivenhoe, a path much walked, but never so appreciated as during that time out onto the jetty over the River Colne. With our horizons necessarily constrained, we sought out the landscapes within. We looked down and found the microcosmic delights of the bolt holes, of the timbers of the jetty, each a unique and vibrant array of mosses and lichens. So that was our story during the first part of the COVID pandemic. From now, the time being, that's where that particular bit of writing lies. The pandemic is hopefully on the wane. But, as I say, the book did, writing that notional book did have a purpose for us. And of course, the world is moving on. Over in Princeton, they're starting to realise, the powers that be, that domestic guides are the future for their publishing, and they've seen their low-cost, high-volume works outperforming the more erudite, longer, higher-cost, lower print-run works. For example, their British Birds A Pocket Guide was outselling their British Birds Major Guide very significantly. And so the cogs turn, and Princeton suddenly decided what they wanted from us, who are producing 3 volumes in this format. What they wanted from us was 1 volume in that format, initially, the initial product. And that's what we've been working on ever since. A beginner's stroke gateway guide to the 600 or so commonest plants in Britain. We're terming it a springboard guide, even though they won't allow us to put springboard on the cover. We've used the term springboard throughout because that's what the way we see it. We want this guide to be an introduction that will inform and engage people and actually want them to use this springboard to become better botanists and more expansive botanists, and in doing so by our later book, down the line. They wouldn't let us put springboard book on the front because, well, this is actually one way in which Princeton bean counters are very clever. They did all the sorts of searchings and through the internet algorithms, and they realized that if we had it as a springboard guide, it wouldn't appear at the top of the Google searches. So I'm afraid it has to be a pocket guide. At least it's not a beginner's guide. And that's what we were very keen to ensure. Because it's not for beginners, we hope that this guide will be something that even relatively experienced botanists would like to use because, if nothing else, it fits easily in the pocket. So, what went wrong? Well, we did have a deadline for publication last month. It was in the Princeton catalogue. It has been for the last 6 months. Pre-orders are open, but the best laid plans. We lost, as I mentioned, a member of the team. Health issues amongst the rest of the team and their immediate families have taken some focus of progress. And then just before last Christmas, server issues. We use a standalone server to hold the images to hold our work. We employ a server company to maintain and manage that server for us. Well, allegedly, they didn't, and we lost, because of a failure to back up, we lost 2 months' work just before Christmas. That was, shall we say, somewhat dispiriting. 2 months of our lives we will never get back. And of course, that pushed the publication schedule out of kilter somewhat. Fortunately, though, PUP, being an academic publisher, reputation for them is more important than dates. And they're saying, don't worry about the deadline, just make it the best you can. When it will come out, we really don't know. We, as I say, had the deadline for March this year. They're now notionally putting the deadline to July, but I think that's probably a little too soon to be genuinely realistic. If nothing else, of course, they can't start planning in the delivery of the book as a hard copy in terms of ordering paper stock and ordering time at the printers until we actually give them a near final version. It's like the aircraft that's been delayed, circling round and round and round Heathrow before it can land, waiting for its landing slot. That's the position we're going to be in when we eventually get to the end of the process. But there is actually something good come out of the delay, because it has allowed us the luxury of developing the format in ways we'd not really considered before. We've redesigned the key. Here now is the front page to the key overall. As you can see, again, it's threaded through. It's a key which signposts into, it's a key which itself is a springboard. It signposts into the relevant parts of the book where all of the different sections to be found. It gives the idea very correctly that you can identify this by using the key, by using taxonomy, but also by using growth forms and such like as a way into identifying all of the plants in the book. It then leads through 50 or so pages out of the 280 in this sort of format, where the questions from the previous pages of the key lead through into the galleries, these galleries being representatives of various families which meet those botanical criteria which come through here in the key itself. In this way, it actually shares a conceptual DNA with the book that taught me my botany back in the 1970s. And of course, that was this one. Trusted, fitter, and blamey. That's how I started when I was at university. I was at university being taught by Alistair Fitter, honorary fellow of the BNA, of course, father to Richard, who, son of Richard, who gave his name to the BNA Memorial Medal. Within that book, again, frowned upon by the serious botanists perhaps, but there was this key, a most wonderful, simple visual key, relying on things like flower structure, inflorescence structure, number of petals, shape of petals, and color of petals. And that leads you to a group of choices which you can then look through the book to find out which one works. In that way, it's very similar to our book. And that was what I was actually very keen to establish, because I found this approach very, very effective at teaching me botany before I'd ever seen a copy of what was Clapham, Tooting and Warburg at the time. And I have to say, it was quite some time before I felt sufficiently confident to work my way through the proper floras like Clapham, Tooting and Warburg. So in our book, It goes from those galleries and then takes you to the families. And the families have their own keys. In this case, a bit of wordy keys which help you through to the different subsections of a family. This actually is the entire 3 pages, 1.5 spreads, which cover the Papaveraceae completely. I think Rob, as the graphic designer, has done a fantastic job here of actually condensing it down into a way which is instructive, constructive, and provides all the information you could possibly want, whether it be the flowers, whether it be the seed pods, so on and so forth, together with, once again, this information around a lot of it in icon form, around things like flowering period and so on and so forth. So that is very much how we expect now that it is going to look. Remember that I called it a springboard guide to the commoner plants. Yes, it is a springboard guide, and I've discussed that term already. Commoner plants, well, commoner plants, by that we mean the most widespread plants. And of course, now we know as accurately as possible which plants are the most widespread in Britain, because the BSBI has just produced, as I've mentioned before, this magnificent pair of books, the 3rd National Atlas of Plants, also actually coincidentally published by Princeton University Press. We can know how common every plant is, at least in the last 20-year period, by counting up the number of 10-kilometre squares, and it's done for us in this book. We are not placing any geographic restriction on that. So, for example, there are quite a few plants which botanists from the southeast of England particularly would not really think would be amongst those commonest plants. Plants like bog asphodel. Ireland and Scotland are pretty darn big places, and if you fill up Ireland and Scotland with dots, then you get to the criterion that we used as the cutoff for the number of squares to be included in the guide to the most widespread plants. So we're being totally non-judgmental in terms of the fact that most botanists live down in the bottom right-hand corner, but we are treating the entirety of the Northeast Atlantic archipelago as our geographic unit without prejudice to any particular area. Also, just to be absolutely clear, we are including all higher plants, not mosses and liverworts or algae, but we are covering the ferns and pteridophytes generally. We're covering the gymnosperms, we're covering all water plants, we're covering all the grasses and sedges and rushes as well. So that's another thing which differentiates our guide from many other of the beginners or pocket guides which are available on the market. We've mentioned the Atlas. I must just pause there to talk very, very briefly about the Atlas in a little more detail, because not only is it an Atlas of 2 wonderful heavy volumes, it's also accompanied by the most amazing website. So if you can't afford or can't carry the Atlas, all of the information and more from the 2 volumes are now available for free at that website. You don't even have to be a member of the BSBI. It's there for free. Possibly the most impressive online botanical resource in the world. Here I've just chosen pages for one species, one thing that's quite close to my heart, greater yellow rattle, given that I did my PhD on yellow rattle species. I've just chosen this one as an example, but you see, within the atlas you have, and indeed on the website, you have a distribution map, a dot distribution map with other information around and about, including the all-important count of number of squares up here, which defines whether or not the plant is included in our list of the most widespread species. This one isn't. Its commoner relative, Rhinanthus minor, is. But the atlas contains an awful lot more as well. Information and hyperlinks through to threat status and conservation designations on a particular tab. It contains photographs as well, a large number of which myself and Rob Still have contributed, hence the fact that we got given a copy of the hard copy of the atlas. That's why I've had to reinforce our bookshelves. So lots and lots of visual resource in there as well, together with very important things. This is first and foremost a conservation tool, so analysis of trends is important, together with things like flowering periods, different places in the country, all of which is important information, particularly at times of climate change when things are changing in terms of flowering. And of course, the all-important altitudinal zonation of the species concerned. All of these are available at the click of a button along the tabs on the page in the website. Do use it, it is fantastic. So just to return to writing for a minute, writing a book like we've been writing and are still writing is a little bit mind-numbing. It's a bit like writing those haikus about the mammals for the DK book, condensing the amount of information and picking out the key important features for identification of any particular plant. It's all a bit mind-numbing. It's not exactly creative, which of course is why I do try and write creatively on my website to actually just expand my brain a little bit, and indeed also in other projects. Just talk about a couple of those very briefly, because these two are also Wild Guides, Princeton publications. Came out only a month ago. Teesdale's Special Flora, that's a project that Jude and I together worked upon. It was written by Margaret Bradshaw, as you see there in the middle, 97 years old. Fantastic lady who's looked after the flora of Teesdale for the last 70 years, but never before written a book. I helped persuade her to write it 15 years ago. Finally, last year it appeared. It needed a certain editing, shall we say, which Jude and I gave it very comprehensively, and so much so that Princeton took it on, and it was published. And there's Margaret at the launch of that book just at the beginning of March. 97 years old, running that launch event in front of their Lord Barnard behind her, and an audience of 70, running that like an absolute professional. Her mind is as fit as it ever has been, with memories going back 70 years or 7 days, all equally and wholly intact. An inspiration, an absolute inspiration. So that was quite good fun, taking Margaret's words and keeping Margaret's voice, but actually condensing it into a way that many people would want to read. And it seems that many people do, because it's well exceeded Princeton's hopes and expectations in its sales. Another one that we've taken on for Princeton is just about to be formally published is Edible Fungi, Britain, Northern Europe. This was a Danish book, which was translated from the Danish into English by a Dane. that needed, again, a degree of copy editing in order to make it sound like English. Jude and I took that one on, and again, felt a lot more creative, perhaps, than writing the entries for my particular plant guide. But they're just the additional projects that have been taken on simply to keep mind ticking over. After 20 years, DK have come back in on the scene and just published, first of all, the one on the left has just been published. The updated version of the one on the right is about to be published. So yes, last year, it has to be said, was for us the year of books, writing, editing, copy editing, and so on and so forth. So this summer, all being well, this new field guide will be added to our streaming bookshelves. After that, well, what next? First of all, this may be published as an ebook, although its light weight might mean that it won't be, because it won't be a huge burden to anyone in the field. What we are not going to be doing is to be publishing an app, one of these apps that identifies things for you. Just as we want to get away from the field guides that go by the flick and pick approach, we also want to get away from the crap from the app approach. There is no substitute for learning how to identify by doing it properly, instead of pointing a phone and waiting it to give you the right, or often as not, wrong answer. As I say, the pocket guide was intended as a springboard guide to the wonderful world of botany. And in the next 2 or 3 years, we hope to be publishing the full 3-volume work. And taken together, we hope that the 4 books will encourage a core of botanists to take the next leap forward and to be able to contribute to the publication of the next atlas of the British flora in another 20 or so years' time. We can only hope that by then, the stories of loss and decline, which are all too apparent in the new atlas, may then have been reversed. And that all is what classes as retirement in our household. Thank you for listening to me. I'll take it off screen share and happily answer any questions.